Hi, welcome to another BAPT in Conversation webinar. Great today to be welcoming Rich Thompson, who's from the Myers-Briggs Company. He's based in the US. It's now a global company. He's actually the Senior Director of Global Research, and his background is as an industrial and organizational psychologist, background in psychometric development, also an aviation aviation background as well before that. So yeah, welcome, Rich. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you, Richard, for having me. Appreciate it. And I'm doing great. I'm winding down my vacation, so I'm glad we were able to make this work.
Yeah, so it's really good to have you here. I guess, you know, you're one of the psychologists in the Myers-Briggs Company. How long have you been with the company for?
I've been at the now Myers-Briggs Company. We've had other names in the past since September of 2000, so about almost 22 years.
Yeah, and before that, there was CPP in the States.
Right, and before that, Consulting Psychologist Press.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's be clear as well, like, you know, what the company itself employs quite a considerable number of qualified and experienced psychologists, right? There's a lot of people there with good qualifications.
So the way, yes, I would say yes. I can't give you an exact number, but we have people in a variety of different roles beyond research who are either what we would call in the US a master's level or a doctoral level psychologist, or in the UK, I believe the term is certified psychologist. Is that right?
Chartered is kind
chartered.
of, yeah.
Chartered, thank you, yes. Or chartered psychologists in the UK or possibly other areas. And then we also have an extensive network of psychologists in our distributor network. So for example, we have people we work with in South Africa or in Korea or in China who are also psychologists. So inside our federation, for lack of a better term, we have a fairly large number of people with psychology degrees and or backgrounds.
Yeah, and it's just making the point, because I think sometimes critics of the MBTI, they look back at the origins of it, you know, as a kind of a family creation, and the originators of the MBTI. And they don't realize how there's been many decades of development beyond that by, you know, qualified psychologists in a very large global sense in this company.
Right, a great example of that, and we'll talk about it more, but on the global research that we did a few years ago, internally we had 3 PhDs, and then externally we had in the US 2 additional PhDs plus a member of the family on the team. And then we had our extended network where we had, again, chartered psychologists or doctoral level psychologists with a PhD or PsyD who were involved from, if my memory is correct, 1, 2, 3, from 5 other countries. So we had, you know, almost a dozen psychologists and 1 non-psychologist involved in the development of it. And you're absolutely right. People don't pay any attention to that when we go and talk about the MBTI, or when they're criticizing it. It's always, they're still talking about the versions that were, you know, 3 or 4 versions ago.
Yeah, I mean, talking about that, I'm aware that in the 90s, the late 90s or mid to late 90s, there was a major revision of the questionnaire and the MBTI itself, wasn't there? And I've talked with Roger Pearman and Mark Majors. I think both of them were potentially involved in that.
Mark Majors definitely was. Roger may have been, I don't honestly know. That was a little bit before my time. I came on board the company right as that was, for us in the US, it was Form M and Form Q were being released. And then there was a separate effort in Oxford by Robert McHenry and Betsy Kendall to develop the European versions of Step 1 and Step 2. But those efforts all happened in the late 90s, yeah.
Yeah, so obviously you've got the forms, the different versions of the MBTI, named a bit like we name MI6 agents in James Bond.
Right, exactly, yep.
You've got letters for the forms. But it's interesting, a lot of the kind of the roots of the criticisms about reliability and validity go back to like Form G, and like actually an earlier version where there was the Pittenger articles
Correct.
Sizing it right. And that was so to clarify for people, is it the case that, reliability and validity are properties that you can derive from testing a questionnaire instrument, and they're specific to a version of an instrument?
Correct. That's right. Yes. So the way to think about, I'm not sure this is exactly your question, but reliability is part of the instrument in a particular sample, and validity is an attribute of the instrument in a particular sample. So when people say, what's the reliability or what's the validity, and they're in their mind, they're going to get some sort of table or a value, they're not understanding the concepts correctly. So if I take the MBTI and I use it in a sample or a population where it's intended to be used, so I use it with people who are over 18 who have, or English speakers who have a high enough reading level, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I'm going to get good estimates of the reliability. If I use it in a sample that's not its target, so people who have poor English skills, people who are age 10, people who have some other attribute that's not a normal person, and I get bad reliability indicators, that's not part of the measure, that's because you've done a bad sample. And that happens all the time in published literature. I did a study with college students, and found this. Well, college students are a subsample of the total population of interest, but they are not the total population of interest, and what were their motivations, and so on and so forth. Similarly, for validity studies, you have to use the right population or sample drawn from the right population, and for an appropriate purpose. One of my favorites, written by a person I used to work with many, many years ago, was highly critical of Form G as a selection tool for air traffic controllers. And I'm like, you should have never used that. Now, the original purpose of that study was just describe and understand air traffic controllers. But it was never intended for selection. So you're criticizing it for not doing something it's not intended to do. And one of my colleagues has a phrase, any tool can be the right tool when talking about, construction. But if you take a screwdriver and try to pound a nail, it's not fair to criticize the screwdriver when you should have been using a hammer. And that's a lot of what happens, is it doesn't do what it wasn't intended to do, and therefore I don't like it.
So that's one of the big issues to clear up first, is then, how or why is the MBTI a fundamentally different kind of assessment to the typical trait assessments that most people study in universities nowadays?
Well, I'm a bit of a heretic on this particular point. And the difference is really in the theory that underlies it. And so the theory is a type theory, or categorical theory. We're going to say that the theory says that people fall into one of these as their, preferences from this pair of preferences. That's going to be their high score, or their preferred, element of EI or SN or what have you. That's a theoretical issue. Okay. So other measures of personality say, no, these are on a continuum, and you're either high or low on a thing. But with type theory, people are I'm just go with the easy one, extrovert and introvert. You're either an extrovert or you're an introvert. That means that's your go-to, that's your preference. That's what you do if you're in your world where you don't have external pressure. It's what you feel best doing. However, that doesn't mean you can't do the opposite. It means you just don't prefer it. You can do it. It takes more energy and effort. The whole, exercise of writing your name with your left and your right hand is a demonstration of preference. So it's a theoretical difference in how it works. And the theory is the theory, right? From a measurement perspective, what we're doing is we're measuring things using traditional measurement approaches. People will criticize the items, they're dichotomous items. All a dichotomous item does is give you less information per item. There's no difference. If I have a semantic differential item where I'm using good on one end and bad on the other, and I have 10 points, I just get a lot more information along that continuum, right? But they're harder to score and they're harder to use. And so again, if you go back to when all this was created, there wasn't computerized scoring, and doing high-end math was not something Isabel wanted people to do. So she chose to make dichotomous items. Now I don't know if I'm answering, I'll try to get back to your question, but we've dabbled with, longer response sections, and we find that we get, as you would expect, more information per item. We can actually reduce the number of items. And we can still put people into, as I call it, a bucket. I can still be an E or an I. I don't have to have a midpoint, right? I can still make people choose. I have talked to the foundation. We have talked about doing this. We just haven't done it yet. But there's no reason you can't do that. So from a measurement perspective, what we're doing is very traditional measurement. And at the end of the day, what we're doing that's different somewhat, I'm going to caveat that, different somewhat from other personality approaches, is we're saying we're going to put a cut in the middle and we're going to put people into one of two categories. Other instruments, if you get your results, I believe this is a true statement, not for all, but for many, you're going to get something like you're high in dominance, you're high in openness, you're low in openness, you're in the middle in openness. Those are still categories. Instead of two, it's three. We're criticized for something everybody does. We're just explicit about it. We're explicitly going to put you into one of two buckets, whereas the rest of them say we're going to sort of explicitly do it, but we're not going to really talk about it. And they do that to make it more understandable and interpretable for the end user. Does that answer your question?
One of my questions. Yeah, so it's a good point. Yeah, in the interpretation of say the Neo PI3, which I've trained in myself. Yeah, I mean, for development with people, it's a lot. You do typically talk about those three, sort of kind of typical average range or high or low. I mean, whether someone's like 41% or 43% or something doesn't really matter. Do you know what I mean? In terms of the percentiles, it's more about a general comparison. And I guess that's the sense what you get from the MBTI is you get a kind of broad comparison. You don't get an accurate amount of how much that difference is. I think one of the things I've seen which would really help me is understanding MBTI is ipsative. Like essentially, it's about ranking things as kind of more or less comfortable or natural. And you could rank them by quantity and say, oh, it's this much more natural, but that's not MBTI. And I think people miss that they assume that it should be quantifying something.
Right. We get at, again, be a bit of a heretic here. We get at some of that with if the audience is still using the European versions, they had something called the PCI. Form M and Q had the PCI, Preference Clarity Index. And that index is getting at what you're talking about. And people will interpret their PCI that way. And of course, the type practitioners will go, no, that's not right. But there is some truth in that if you're a high PCI extrovert, what it means is your extrovert introvert dichotomy is more clear, it's more differentiated, more well developed. So, or alternatively, you have fewer pressures in your environment to behave in a way that's inconsistent with your preference. So there is a fuzzy area there. And again, from a measurement perspective, that's what we're doing is we know that when people are more clear, they are more consistent over time in answering the questionnaire. And we know that we're more correct in our categorization, if you will, saying that this person has a preference for extroversion or a preference for introversion. When people are less clear, they're more inclined to have one or two items that switch on retest, or to just struggle during the interpretation process with which one is right. Using myself as an example, of course, I've been doing this for too long now. But when I took the MBTI the very first time, I came out ISTP, but my SN was right. I'm one item away from flipping. And my JP, same, one item away from flipping. The EI, TF, absolutely clear. And I spent years talking to experts because I was new to the company and I had access to experts, and working kind of through that to get to what I believe now with great confidence. My preferences are for IST and P, but I was never clear, and a lot of that was environmental press. So Damien Killian, if you know who Damien is, was actually the person. He asked me some really obscure questions and was like, "You're absolutely an S." But at the end of the day, that lack of clarity is what makes measurement challenging. So the MBTI, unlike other instruments, tries to have items that are focused on the subtle differences in the middle, and not a lot of items that are focused on the really clear differences on the ends, if you will, of clarity. And we know that for people who are clear on any of the 4 preferences, we can get 100% accuracy with like 3 or 4 items, because there's a handful of, quote, really good items that really differentiate people who are clear. But because almost no one is clear on all 4 preferences, we spend a lot of energy, a lot of items, if you will, trying to get those people who aren't clear into the right bucket or the right preference. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense, because you just explained how even working in that company, the thing that you're trying to explore with type is so subtle that even, like you said, it took you a very long time to really unpick what the phenomena was you were actually looking for, which is why I got, it's unethical for people who, as we're trained to know that it's unethical to put questionnaire in front of someone for MBTI and not to give them a feedback session, a best fit session to explore it, because like you said, even that might not get them to the point. And so I'm trying to put my finger on, what is the subtlety that type is, that it's not about behavior, it's not about what we express, because that might be a question of our disposition, i.e. the underlying preference, but it might be environmental pressures, it might be something else. Is it not possible to pick those up in a questionnaire, or is there kind of a restriction on what you can do in developing it because of the history of the MBTI, that you couldn't just go back and re-engineer it to pick up on those things?
Oh, wow. Okay, so historically, I'm gonna indirectly answer your question. When we talked earlier about the M&Q and the European Step 1 and 2 work that was done in the late 90s, the foundation, then the authors, the copyright holders, Peter and Kathy and others, were directly involved in that work. And they we actually took some, so we had a woman whose name escapes me at the moment, who was given a contract to go out and write some new MBTI items. So she had Isabel's old items, and she took that as inspiration to write new items. They also took apart, if you go back to the older forms, not all of the items are dichotomous. There's some that have 3 answers, there's some that have 4, and there's some that have 5. And they took those apart and tried to get it to dichotomous to simplify the scoring, particularly on the self-scorables. Again, 20 years ago, self-scorable was the #1 selling thing. Computers weren't, the internet didn't exist yet. It did, but it didn't. So what they found was that the items that she wrote from whole cloth didn't work very well. It's not because she wasn't competent. She was a trained psychometrician. And the items that they took apart from Isabel's tended to work okay. But Isabel's items, the original item set, which is actually much more extensive than what most people are used to. She had 300 or 400 total items in her item set. Most of us have only seen a sub portion of those. But the items that she wrote seemed to be the ones that still worked the best. So when they did that, they ended up using a lot of her items. And then when we did the global version, because we were approaching it from a somewhat different perspective, meaning we wanted to do it globally, not in the US and then say, here world, go translate it. We wanted to test simultaneously samples from around the planet in their own language. There was a decision made by the foundation to limit us to those items. If you think about it from a research perspective, by those items, I mean Isabel's, the set of items that were used in the, so that's why you don't see radical changes in the item content. In fact, the global versions are almost a mishmash of what we ended up in the US and the UK for step one, and a mishmash of step two. And so about 70%, if my memory's right, of the items that you all will see in Europe will be familiar to you. Half of those were already on step one. That's not, but there's already overlap on European step one and step two. So that's where I get that 70% of it. So about 30% will be new to you. But so there's a limitation put on us, but it was not because they don't want us to do it, is because we were trying to do this differently than it's ever been done before. And it's a totally different research project to go out and start writing items in English and then testing those in other languages and then bringing them all back versus saying, okay, we already have items that we know work well, let's translate those and now choose from that pool the very best items that work reasonably well across all of the languages, countries, and cultures that we included in our sample. So there's probably a work to be done to find, even better items maybe that get at these preferences that are not traceable back to Isabel. But that's not work that we have been doing. And I don't know that we will do it anytime soon, given the level of effort it took to do the global revision. Was truly a Herculean effort. And I think it's working very well when it's being used. So I don't see us doing anything with that anytime soon. I will say this, on a different project, a guy on my team who has left the company did a lot of work looking at behavioral attributes associated with the different types. And I think there's some room in those to get at perhaps different items that aren't on the current instruments. But we were also, again, with kind of the global, the fact that the world's gone global, we were very focused on using very short phrases. So the MBTI, is kind of a mix of the phrase items and then the word pairs. And the word pairs tend to be easier to translate and retain the original meaning than the phrase items. So that's work we were doing, but it hasn't been integrated into the instrument yet.
Just to summarize, I guess what I'm hearing is that, there's a lot of real practical issues with like making changes to the MBTI because it's such a big job. It's almost like an oil tanker in motion, and this is going to take a huge amount of work. And it's not just that you kind of tie to the kind of honoring the kind of the original intentions of the Isabel and their family. It's that the actual work involved is going to be dramatic. You can't just listen to the criticisms that psychologists are making, going, "Oh, fine, we'll just go and redesign the whole thing to get around those issues." It's like there's some real massive practical implications of that anyway.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's not just, we could go off and go crazy, but then you'd have to ask yourself, how is it any different than one of them, plethora of not MBTI instruments out there doing type?
It wouldn't be the same thing. And then you'd get criticized for copying other people and trying to do
right, exactly. Yeah, it's not just psychometrics, it's politics and big picture and corporate history, and even whenever we've done a change from one form to another, and this is not we love the people who use the MBTI, we love the practitioners, we love their enthusiasm and their commitment to the instrument, and the theory. But then, if we did something radical, the criticism would switch from academics to our practitioners, because they don't want us to go and change everything either. So it's part of listening to the customer base and part of trying to deal with the critics. We spend a lot more energy dealing with the critics now. When I first started, the standing orders were we're just not going to deal with them. We're going to ignore them, and that was probably not the right thing to do. And now we do take them on, and discussions like this, and we've done a variety of different things over the years. But they, to your point, you brought it before, the Pittenger article that is, I don't know, 92 or something like that. They're still using 30 and 40-year-old studies to criticize the MBTI. And when we send them material that says, here, look at this, they don't. So it's a tough spot to be in, really.
Yeah, so there's a few issues, I think I'd like to get into some of the specifics now. But one of the issues is being criticized for something that's either incorrect or is maybe misattributed to the MBTI. I don't want to go too far into it, but we know there's confusion between, that there is the 16 personalities like assessment out there for free on the internet, and it's become very popular, and it's not even designed in the same way. And I've seen psychologists using criticisms effectively of that, which isn't the MBTI. And there's a kind of a confusion because there's communities of young people using the term MBTI to refer to something that isn't even the MBTI.
Yeah, so you cut out for a second. Were you talking about 16 personalities?
Yeah, so I was talking about that. That's, I guess, taken a different business model, so to speak, and gone with sort of the putting it out there on the internet for free. So that's something that's very visible, and yet people confuse it with the actual MBTI, and they don't always have access to, because the MBTI stuff is behind sort of closed doors of training courses and things, and manuals you have to pay for and things. So, I guess they're seeing what they can see out there on the internet for free, and then making attributions that aren't even about the thing they're talking about. It's not the MBTI.
Well, I think it's, frankly, poor copyright exercise on our part. There's terms out there that we use where companies have lost control over their IP. So Xerox, right, for a photocopy, or Kleenex for a tissue. The term MBTI, we go after people, from a copyright perspective, if they use MBTI, but the back door then is, well, it's a Jungian, thing, or it's like the MBTI, and then we can't do anything about that. And just like any profession you think of, the people who do it know it much better than the people who are consumers of it, right? And so there's massive interest in type and how to make use and understand type. That's far larger than the base that we tap into with the actual MBTI. I'm not sure exactly what the question was, but if you think about like what 16 personalities does, they're much more of a traditional psychological measure where you take it, here's your results, there's no discussion about it. And that is not how the MBTI is used. It's not how the MBTI was intended to be used. You mentioned earlier the ethical imperative to have that interpretation. But that's also what that consumer base, if you will, has been trained to do. So in the United States, at least, there is a lot of testing that goes on, starting in first grade, kindergarten, and on up. They take, cognitive skills tests, they take social skills tests, they take everything you can imagine. And there's no interpretation of those, they're handed results. This is how they've been trained. Trust the professional and the results. So it's actually, the MBTI and the best fit type process is actually very different than what they're used to consuming. And so I don't think they don't know enough to even question, is what I'm driving towards. That the not MBTI type measures are not doing it the way it is intended to be done, and are not even the original, because we've lost control of our terminology, I guess you could say.
Yeah. So then we'll focus on the actual MBTI, which is, the questionnaire developed by Myers-Briggs Company and its predecessors, that people can only access officially. There's no free knockoffs online that are the actual MBTI. And the actual reliability and validity, let's get into the details of that, because that's based on your actual questionnaire.
Right.
And especially the new version now, which is saying is the global one, which is the latest iteration.
Right.
And so we'll talk about reliability first. As far as I can put it simply, consistency. It's like, if you took the thing, either part of the questionnaire and then the other part, do they give you similar answers? If you take it one time and another time, does it give you similar answers? Is that how you see reliability?
Yeah, so there's two kinds of reliability, big picture. There's the internal consistency, which you mentioned, and there's a variety of ways of looking at that. When we do internal consistency reliability estimates, and I emphasize the word estimates because they're estimates, they're not hard and fast. It doesn't have a reliability of 0.92. The estimate from this sample is that it's this, okay? But the internal consistency reliabilities, done through alphas or split halves or what have you, we get very good reliability estimates. So for people who are particularly number oriented, the Form M in the United States, all of the estimates were above 0.9, and that was by design to deal with this criticism issue, but it led to some items that were a little bit redundant. When we did the global version, the US sample, they're 0.88 and 0.89, not that much of a difference. There are some countries where it's a little bit lower in the total sample, if my memory is right. I haven't looked at that in a long time, but yeah, they're very high. They're very good. So internal consistency, fine. And that is at the preference level. So we're measuring 4 things, not one thing. So we estimate that for each of the 4 preferences. They're very good. Where the MBTI tends to get in trouble with critics is on test retest. And here's what people do to do test retest is you administer the instrument to some people once, then you administer it to them again after some period of time has gone by. That period of time might be a week, 2 weeks, a month, who knows? The longer the amount of time that goes on in between, the lower those correlations. That's just what happens, regardless of the instrument. I don't have it in front of me, but our time interval is actually fairly long, and that was by design. The way we collected the data, we did it through a vendor, and so we had people take it, and then we came back to them and had them take either the MBTI again or one of many other instruments as part of the validation work. Our test retest correlations per preference are, again, very good. Where the MBTI is different than other instruments is that it doesn't just look at those preferences individually. It says, no, we're going to treat your personality as a constellation or a configuration or a whole set of these 4, some combination of them, right? Let's say 16 types. Now, to be fair, every other personality instrument does the same thing. If you take it once, they correlate the scores time 1 and time 2, they go, there's our test retest. But when they do an interpretation, if you went, going back to what you talked about before, and you can correct me if I'm misspeaking on the NEO, but if you went from high to low, from time 1 to time 2, that would lower the overall correlation. It would also change how you interpret the results, right? But they don't test that. They never, ever, 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 ever test that.
Cut out.
We actually went to several different, okay, fine. So what happens with the MBTI is you can't look at it as, are we perfect? So the criticism is, you're not perfect. You're not getting 100% repeats from time 1 to time 2 on those 4 preferences. Your lack of perfection is in fact a problem. If you look at it a different way, but wait, if the uses, then people should be changing their type basically willy-nilly, right? It should be, I'm an I, next time I'm an E. And then when you put all of those together, we should see basically a flat amount of repeatability, right? Well, instead, and I have a chart. I don't want to necessarily go down that path at this point, but we have it online. There's if you don't mind me mentioning it, there is a website we've created. If you just Google MBTI facts, or MBTI facts page, FACTS page, we have all of this information there, and people can go and look at it at their leisure. But if it were truly random, then what you would see is there's a 6.25% of getting any one 4-letter type. Look at what we actually get. We're well over. We're not perfect, but we're well over what you expect by chance. And so what we see is that most people get the same letter on 3 of the 4. A fairly large number get the same letters on 4 of the 4. But we're well above chance, which is what you'd expect if, in fact, it were absolutely random getting these combinations put together. Does that make sense, or is that just absolutely?
Yeah. So I mean, there's the typical reliability where you look at the consistency, like over time, over two people, same person taking the assessment twice.
And that's done with correlations, right? That's done with correlations. Everybody else does it with correlations because they're only comparing one measure at 2 time periods. And we're doing, and when we do that, our retest reliabilities are great. It's that next step of the interpretation of the 4 together where we're explicit. This is how we do it. And the other providers aren't as explicit or don't even mention it, even though in practice, that's how it's used. And then we exceed what you'd expect if it were true gibberish or just random garbage. We vastly exceed what you'd expect in terms of consistency over time. And different time intervals, it goes down. There's a study that unfortunately hasn't been published yet, where they looked at people 50 years after they took the MBTI the first time, and they're still exceeding what you'd expect by chance if it were gibberish by like 4 times. They're 4 times chance. Shorter time intervals were like 9 times chance. So if you think about it that way, which is how I think it should be thought about, and others may not agree, we're doing very well on the retest. And we also know, and this goes back to something we talked about a little bit before, we also know that it's the people who aren't clear who tend to switch a letter. If my memory is right, on the global sample, which is about 16,000 people, 0 people switched all 4 letters, 0. If it were gibberish, we would have a whole bunch of people who switched all 4 letters, right? So the people who aren't clear are the ones who maybe 1 or 2 items can flip them from an E to an I, an S to an N, what have you. And when we talked about the clarity issue before, that's important because maybe it's an environmental press, maybe it's mindset, maybe it's who knows what is going on in that person's world when they took it at time 1 and time 2. But the people who are clear very rarely switch letters. And so there's something about getting more clarity that I think helps people. And that goes back to what we talked about earlier on about spending some time with the information. And all of the not MBTI instruments don't even invite you to do that. They say, here's your stuff, go. And they don't invite you to spend any time thinking about it and understanding it and really grasping and knowing what it is about you that makes these feel right or not. And so I think the whole experience is different, not just the psychometrics, but the experience is different. And that's the value the MBTI has over those other instruments.
So the bottom line is, if people are on social media say, things like MBTI is not reliable, you've got the data there, which you've done, with qualified psychologists have done this to the standards expected of modern psychometrics. And you've put your assessment through testing with a relevant group. As you said before, it's about context, and you've got to have the relevant group to test. And it's come out, and each dimension has exceeded what dimensions are supposed to aim for, which is, I think, around 0.8 out of 1 in terms of reliability. And they actually for 0.9 or higher. Is that right in terms of each dimension?
On the global version, most of the, so it gets tricky because we have the total sample and we have each country culture sample.
Yeah.
And I say country culture, it's not even country culture, it's sort of country culture, but it's also language. So in China, we have 2 different samples, right? Because they have 2 different written languages. In Canada, we have 2 different languages because they have French and they have English. And then in other countries, you know, we have a sample from Germany, but people in Switzerland and Austria, you know, they speak German. Anyway, the range is generally from just to almost 0.9 down to a 0.8, like you mentioned. There are a couple of countries, Chinese in particular, where we're a little bit lower than that. And we know we need to do some work on the Chinese translations, but we just haven't done that yet. And then when you get into step 2, it's now you've got not only the preferences, but the facets. Some of those are a little bit lower as well, because there's a lot fewer items going into a facet than there are items going into a preference, and more items tends to enhance reliability. But yes, in summary, your statement is true. Unless somebody's using a different standard, our test-retest correlations and our internal consistency reliability estimates definitely meet or exceed the standard. And then we've talked, and I won't go on about it anymore, the issue of the 4-letter type.
Yeah.
And it's just, they're not thinking about it correctly, in my opinion.
Because it's a different kind of instrument. It's not just quantifying individual dimensions, it's bringing together, I like the word constellation, to things together. And then, if you were to take the reliability of each of those 4 scales, you have to multiply them, because that effectively makes it smaller, and that's the problem.
Right, exactly.
But that's because it works in a very different way to typical trait assessment. As you've said just before, then there is this case to show that, it's not just random, because, there's a lot of people who are very clear and they stay clear and it doesn't change. There's a few people who, for various reasons, are less clear, but people aren't just changing all 4 letters randomly. That is just not happening.
Right, exactly. It's not just randomly happening.
There's a good basis to show that you are picking up on something, but as you said, it's quite a complex thing. It's not just about behavior as it's expressed, and it can take even people like yourself who work with this instrument sometimes quite a long time, even years, to really unpick the phenomenon of type over your kind of experience of your lifetime and who you are, and natural and what's not, and what's environmental and what's not, and that kind of thing. So let's look at the next bit, which is the validity. And I mean, that's essentially, does this questionnaire measure what it's supposed to measure? I think that's one way people describe it. Can we believe that this is doing what it says it's doing? And there's various ways that that's done, by either can it predict things? Is it predictive? That's the kind of the gold standard. We could talk about in a minute. But then there's other ways of like the construct validity. Is it similar to other things in a similar area, like personality in general? So I don't know if you want to talk about either of those, either predictivity or the correlations with other instruments.
Sure. So if you look at the correlations, I'll start with the easy one. If you look at correlations with other instruments, again, it's not just willy-nilly. You should sit down and say, okay, they're measuring this thing and they define it this way. We're measuring this thing, we define it that way. They should correlate, or perhaps they should not. And so it's not like you have to think about what you're correlating. It's not just a mechanical activity. But when you look at the correlations with the MBTI, say, for example, with Big 5, you'll see very high correlation between their version of extroversion and our version of introversion, extroversion. They're a negative correlation because for them, higher scores mean more extroversion. It just happens for the MBTI. If you think about it from the way it's scored, we call it left, right, mid. The left side is extroversion, so you get this negative correlation. It's quite high. It's not 1. Why is it not 1? Because they're actually talking more about gregariousness, talkativeness, lack of shyness. The MBTI, the theory says it's not about that. Those are behavioral attributes you'll see. They're talking about getting energized by other people, right? Energized by your environment. So extroversion for the MBTI, all of the elements for the MBTI are an energy model. You know, you're energized by this or you're drained by this. You can do it for so long and then you get exhausted and you need to switch and do the opposite. We see good correlations on EI. They're not 1, which is great because ours theoretically is different than what they're talking about. We see good correlations between elements of the NEO model and the remaining preferences. When you look at neuroticism, the correlation is effectively 0. Theoretically, there is no neuroticism in type. That's purposeful. Jung didn't have that in his model. Isabel doesn't have it in her model. The neuroticism component of Big 5 is just picking up all of the stuff that's kind of, you know, non-normal behaviors or attributes of people in a very, you know, large catch-all bucket. It's where all the stuff that is kind of weird goes when you do the factor analysis, right? So and then when we look at, you know, CPI or other things, the correlations more or less follow what you would hypothesize and theorize. So that's evidence of validity in terms of, sorry, I lost my train of thought, but that's evidence of validity if you think it through. The other evidence of validity can be an element of construct validity, which is, do the measures hold up the way they're supposed to? And so a lot of work was done, again, some of the things that happen in psychology are driven by technology. So starting in the, I want to say, late 90s, this thing originally it was called Lizroll, and they almost lost control of that trademark as well, but it's structured equation modeling can be done, where I can say, I'm going to specify the measurement model, I'm going to specify other relationship models. And when we look at the MBTI, the 4-factor model, 4 preferences, is the model that holds up the best compared to a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever you want to do model. So that's very complicated mathematical stuff, but the model tends to hold best in an appropriate sample for the 4 factors or the 4 preferences. Then the last one, which is the one that I think is perhaps the most troubling, but again, I'm going to say you have to always pause and ask about the theory, is some of the predictions with work-related outcomes. So one of the criticisms is, well, Big 5 can predict people's work performance. Big 5 can predict people's job satisfaction. Big 5 can predict, you know, this, that, and the other thing. Well, the theory is very, very clear for the MBTI. There's no one type that can do a job. All types can do all jobs. All types can be satisfied in all jobs. There might be some small differences in satisfaction, but we don't expect ISTJs to only be accountants and to be super satisfied when they're an accountant only. And we don't expect, you know, ENFPs to only be, you know, counseling psychologists and to only be satisfied when they're counseling psychologists. The theory is very clear that if you can't get your needs met, again, their energy model, if you can't get your needs met at work, perhaps you get your needs met somewhere else so that you can live your best type. So when we look at the data that we have on occupations, we do see, what's the right word? We do see differences in where people tend to go from an occupational perspective. But all types can be equally satisfied in that they just learn how to adapt to the job. And the same is true for job performance. The ISTJ and the ENFP accountant might both be accountants. The ISTJ accountant might be with one of the big 4 accounting firms, and maybe the ENFP accountant is working for an NGO. and they follow the rules, but the ISTAP accountant just does accounting all day, and the ENFP accountant does accounting things and other stuff that allows some of their other needs to be met. And so when you look at, are they satisfied with their job? The answer is yes. A study that we funded, I guess you could say, and just completely independently, gave the person money and said, go forth and conquer. Published in the Journal of Applied Psychology, a very respected IO journal. They went in and we gave them access to some of our data. And what they did was they went in and they said, okay, we're going to take ONET, which is the United States version of our job catalog, where ONET takes all of the jobs that exist in the United States and breaks them down and says, here are the attributes of that job. Here's the things you need to do. Here's the skills, education, et cetera, et cetera. And they went through and had an independent group of people categorize jobs based on type dimensions. So is this work attribute the thing you have to do, an E or an I thing, an S or an N? Then they went and they said, okay, here's the types of people who are in those jobs. And they did some very complicated math, but they ended up demonstrating that to the extent that people are in a job that more closely match, where the job requirements, the elements of the job itself, more closely match your MBTI preferences, reported type MBTI preferences, you get a little bump up in satisfaction, statistically significant increase. From an effect size perspective, it's not huge, but it's consistent with the idea that there is a small gain in job satisfaction if you're in a job that matches your personality trait, but also consistent with the theory that says it's not as if you're in a job that doesn't match your personality traits, you're dissatisfied. So it's actually very good validity evidence of type doing what the theory says it should do. And a lot of times in the world of IO psychology, we don't worry too much about why stuff works. We just care that it works. And so the fact that conscientiousness is the best predictor of work performance is kind of a no-brainer. Of course, people who are more conscientious are going to do better work, period. Why is that? Well, you can backwards, add some theory to that. But it's not exactly an elegant insight, So if you observe people in a workplace or at home, we've done a number of studies where we've looked at behavioral indicators. You brought that up before, behavioral indicators of type. And we've looked at, there's a couple of different studies we've done that are on that website I mentioned and speak to validity. Unfortunately, they haven't been published. We tried to get them published. The feedback was often, this is the MBTI, we're not going to publish it. Well, what do you do with that? If you can't publish what I thought were really good studies because the academics don't want to publish them, what do you do with that? Well, two of them really quick. One was we did a study where we had people read their type description right out of the ITT booklet and identify, how well it matched me. And they had to rate all of them. Plus we had some distractors in there, right? So we had like 20 different types or 20 different descriptions. We had people rate them. We found that people are able to self-rate their own type more highly than other types. We didn't know, and that's not, super powerful, but if it were astrological interpretations, I can't do what it's called, but the Pisces thing, then they're all positive, right? You can't differentiate. We also did a study, it's kind of complicated, but we took students and we had them rate what type of managerial ratings they would give to people based on the type descriptions. And then we had actual managers. What kind of behaviors would you expect to see from this type of manager, right? What type of behaviors would you expect to see from an ICJ manager, an ENFP manager? Here's the set of behavioral ratings. And then we looked at how well those correlate to actual managers' ratings from actual employees. And we found that you can see people see the manager, in managers, the behaviors that are consistent with their types. Now, it wasn't like a correlation of one, but the pattern was very clear. And so using just kind of those studies, people can see type in themselves. They can see their own, they understand I'm different than other people. They can see expected behaviors in people who of a type. I would expect to see this, and then they actually see it. And I've kind of lost my train of thought, but then the Sitzman article about job satisfaction. So it's not as if, IO psychologists tend to be obsessed with, and there's nothing wrong with that, job performance and job satisfaction and the things that flow from that. And what type says is there's a different way of getting at those same things. It's just not what the psychology community is used to looking at. And final, stop blathering, but if you look at the theory, what does the theory say? We find a lot of consistency with what the theory says should happen and what we see in the data that we are able to collect. So that is evidence of validity. There's plenty of evidence of validity. Again, it's not a thing you see, it's evidence. It's the, in the United States, we have beyond a reasonable doubt for legal. And then for civil, I can't remember the exact phrases, but it's a lower bar. But I think the evidence from the MBTI, if you give it a fair shake, it may not be beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's certainly above, there's nothing there.
Yes, as you're saying, there is good, strong evidence there for validity. As we talked about before, validity is contextual, like it's not just binary either, like how valid is something and for what is it valid, in what circumstance, in what situation, with who is it valid? And
right.
I think sometimes you've basically made the point that people expect, if they don't understand what the theory is actually proposing, they're going to make misjudgments about what they think it should be valid for.
Correct. We see that all the time. Selection is still, people want, where people's brains go is selection. Well, surely I should, if I'm hiring accountants, they should be an ISTJ. No, no, that's not right. Because we have other evidence that says, no, anybody can be an accountant. Any type can be an accountant. You might see more ISTJs, yes, but that's where people want to go with it. And that's not the correct move.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's important for people to understand on what level, there's that subtlety of on what level type works at and what level we can recognize it at in reality. Well, hopefully that's what we help people do in our feedback, our best fit sessions. I think going back to an earlier point, maybe one day there'll be questionnaires that pick up on all of those subtleties and help to divide it and unpack it even more. Do you think, just a final question, where do you see MBTI as an assessment in, say, 20 years time? Do you see something radical like being developed? Do you think they'll get around to changing steering the oil tanker and heading a slightly different direction with it?
Well, I think, I remember if this is before we started the actual recording or not, but psychological measurement's quite crude. We use paper and pencil, for lack of a better term, things to measure things that are going on inside people's brains. I think that as the technology changes and the wearables and the really intrusive nature of some of that stuff continues to evolve, we're going to see, and there's already evidence from some brain studies and things like that, that people of different types, brains light up a little bit differently. I think I don't know that our company will be able to do it. We're not a high tech, we're not Google. We don't have infinite amounts of money to do this kind of stuff. But I think what you're going to see is that the more invasive technologies that can get into your brain and do that sort of stuff are going to see these type-ish things in people's brain structures and how their brains work and how their brains fire. Like I said, there's already some evidence of that. So will we be in that? I don't know. I just don't know. That I think is where things are going to go. And psychology as a whole, has always been about, the study of the mind, how it works. Big part of that is the brain. And I think that there's going to be a move across many disciplines within psychology into getting more into looking at what's actually going on in the brain when people are doing things, rather than having them fill out pieces of paper about what they thought they were doing. That's right. And you know, whether we'll be there or not, I can't say. We're a small company. I know people think we're really big, but we're a very small company in a fairly small niche in the world of psychology. And that tech stuff is, you know, got very, very big names and a lot of money behind it.
Well, it's exciting. Let's hope we see some developments in that area. You know, that it, again, it gives us some more evidence of what's going on, like, you know, on a brain level as well. You know, we've got people at our conference like Dario Nardi, who's done quite a lot of EEG studies. So it'll be interesting to see where it all goes. I think we should draw to a close for this interview today, because it's been really fascinating. So we've made it a little bit longer than we'd originally planned, but I think it's been great to hear your thoughts on and answers to these questions. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. Have a great rest of your day.
I'm sure we can unpack this topic for a long time to come. So maybe we'll have a second interview at some point. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your time away, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Richard. Cheers.
Thanks. And for everyone, one last thought. Rich and John Haxton from the UK Myers-Briggs Company are going to be presenting at the BAPT conference next month in April 2022. So have a look on bapt.org.uk. They're going to be delivering a keynote. Really looking forward to that. So do book the conference. I hope to see you there. All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.